Hello. If you've ever wondered why life feels unfair no matter how good you try to be, don't worry. Tonight, we're not here for comfort. We're here for clarity. You spend your life trying to be significant by being helpful. You volunteer for every extra shift. You say yes when your body is screaming no. You pick up the emotional slack in conversations, relationships, and workplaces. Somewhere along the line, you adopted a belief so silent you barely notice it anymore. If I'm useful, they won't leave me. And because that thought grew roots inside you, you learned to measure your worth in productivity, availability, and emotional labor. It's not your fault. Society quietly rewards this behavior. Workplaces love the dependable overperformer who doesn't complain. Friends love the person who gets it without asking for anything. Lovers enjoy the partner who adapts without conflict. But beneath that praise lies something colder. The more you try to be indispensable, the more invisible you become. It starts with the emotional economy you unconsciously participate in. In this economy, you believe kindness is currency. You believe accommodation secures loyalty. You believe self-sacrifice earns permanence. But the market you're trading in doesn't work like that. People don't value you because of how much you give. They value you according to what your behavior tells them your time and energy are worth. When you give constantly, you're not signaling generosity. You're signaling abundance. And in any market, abundance drives the price down. That's the first brutal truth you avoid. You're not being loved for your usefulness. You're being tolerated for your availability. Your usefulness becomes the leash you tie around your own neck. At first, it feels noble. You're the reliable one, the strong one, the one people can count on. But over time, the leash tightens. People stop asking if you're okay. They assume you are because you always have been. They stop considering your limits because you never enforce any. They stop seeing your effort because it becomes expected. Emotional labor becomes the air you breathe, invisible until missing, unnoticed while present. You think you're building connection, but you're building dependency, and not the good kind. It's the kind where you depend on their validation, and they depend on your self-erasure. And the bitter irony is that your usefulness doesn't make people stay. It makes them comfortable while they're using you, and distant when they're not. This is where the first psychological mechanism reveals itself, the inflation effect. The more you give, the less your giving is worth. You inflate the supply of yourself so much that people stop noticing the value. They don't appreciate your sacrifices because those sacrifices no longer appear as sacrifices. They appear as default settings. You think you're offering gold. They see vending machine convenience. Insert a request, outcome guaranteed. You train people to see you as replaceable by acting like you have no limits. And then comes the resentment, a quiet, acidic resentment that you try to hide because it feels incompatible with your image of being the good one. But resentment is not a flaw, it's feedback. It signals that you are participating in an emotional contract that only you believe exists. You give more to secure closeness, but all you secure is exhaustion. You don't realize it yet, but your obsession with being loved has already made you obedient. You respond to every emotional fluctuation, every unspoken expectation, every possible opportunity to be needed. You tell yourself it's compassion. It's not. It's fear. Fear of being unwanted. Fear of irrelevance. Fear of being ordinary once your usefulness is stripped away. The trap is already set. You give because you fear abandonment. And you fear abandonment because you believe your value exists only in giving. This is not generosity. This is survival masked as virtue. The more you try to prove your worth, the more it dissolves. That's the paradox you never wanted to confront. You keep giving, thinking you're adding value. But in human relationships, value doesn't grow from quantity. It grows from boundaries, scarcity, and authenticity. And you've spent years violating all three. Think about the simple economics of everyday life. If your gym suddenly removed all fees, you'd stop respecting the membership. If your grocery store gave away milk for free every day, you'd question the quality. When something becomes endlessly available, the human mind stops treating it as valuable. It's not cruelty, it's cognitive default. It's how our nervous systems categorize resources in the modern world, with short-term preferences, instinctive cost-benefit analysis, and convenience-driven decision-making. This is where your self-worth quietly erodes. You offer so much of yourself that your presence becomes background noise. People expect your flexibility. They anticipate your willingness. They rely on your emotional cushioning the way they rely on Wi-Fi, crucial when needed, invisible when functioning, and forgotten the moment another device grabs their attention. You tell yourself it's unfair, but the truth is harsher. You trained them to see you this way. This is the emotional inflation effect collapsing your value. Constant generosity creates diminishing returns. Excessive stability creates boredom. Continuous availability creates a downward psychological spiral, where the more you show up, the less anyone believes they need to earn your presence. It's not that people want to mistreat you. It's that you've removed the natural friction that makes reciprocity meaningful. And then comes the worst part, the gratitude paradox. You expect appreciation because you know how much effort you're investing. But the only person who sees that effort is you. Others experience only the outcome, not the labor behind it. They don't feel the sacrifice, only the convenience. They don't sense how much strength it takes for you to stay silent, only the smoothness of not having to deal with your needs. You think you're helping the relationship. In reality, you're removing the opportunity for mutual investment. When you give too much, too early, too consistently, you deprive others of the chance to contribute. And when contribution disappears, so does attachment. It's human psychology. We value what we build. We bond with what we protect. We feel responsible for what cost us something. And you've allowed yourself to become costless, not worthless. Costless. There's a difference, and the human brain feels it. Costless things are easy to enjoy and easy to discard. You don't see this happening because in your mind, you're doing the right thing. You believe kindness is always honorable. You believe consistency is always attractive. You believe sacrifice is always noble. But those beliefs don't align with human cognition. They align with fantasy. Real human behavior is shaped by incentives, effort, and emotional friction. And because you ignored that, you created an unspoken hierarchy within your relationships. You became the giver, and they became the receiver. You became the emotional laborer, and they became the consumer. And without realizing it, you slowly conditioned yourself into a position you can't escape without confronting the truth. Your self-worth became dependent on how much you provide. This is how reciprocity breakdown begins. People stop giving because you absorb all the giving. People stop trying because you remove all the struggle. People stop appreciating because you normalize the extraordinary. When a person is always useful, people stop seeing the person. They see the function. And once you become a function, you become replaceable the moment someone finds a more convenient version of you. One who doesn't feel exhausted, resentful, or quietly broken. But you're not here for comfort tonight. You're here to see the reality. You didn't lose your value. You gave it away piece by piece, wrapped in helpfulness. And every time someone took from you without gratitude, you told yourself, That meant you should give more. You inflated your presence until it collapsed under its own weight. You've been writing contracts your entire life, agreements no one else ever saw, let alone signed. You tell yourself they're simply understandings, mutual respect, common sense. But beneath those polite labels sits a psychological mechanism that shapes most of your suffering. The invisible contract. You give your time, your energy, your emotional stability. In return, you expect understanding, loyalty, reciprocity, not because the other person promised it, but because your mind quietly attached those expectations to your actions. You believe that being endlessly supportive entitles you to being seen. You believe that being patient entitles you to being prioritized. You believe that being useful entitles you to being protected. But when reality contradicts those unspoken terms, you don't confront the situation. You don't renegotiate. You don't withdraw. You do what you've always done. You compensate. You tighten the emotional leash on yourself and double your effort. You give even more. Invisible contracts are the most dangerous because the violation always feels personal, even though the agreement existed only in your own mind. This is where the emotional economy becomes unforgiving. You invest heavily in others, but you do it without transparency. You expect return on investment from people who never agreed to participate in your market. They operate on instincts, convenience, and incentives, not your internal spreadsheet of sacrifices. You track every emotional deposit you make. They don't even know an account exists. And when their behavior doesn't match your internal expectations, when they don't reciprocate, don't notice, don't validate, you don't blame the contract. You blame yourself. Or worse, you blame them. You become resentful of people who were never told the rules of the game you're playing. This is how self-deception loops form. You convince yourself you're giving freely, even though you crave recognition. You convince yourself you're being the bigger person, even though you secretly expect reward. You convince yourself you're compassionate, even though you're bargaining for safety. And every time your unspoken expectations collapse, you pretend it's fine. You silence your disappointment because expressing it feels selfish. But suppressing disappointment doesn't erase it, it compounds. Invisible contracts, when violated, create emotional debt. And because the other person doesn't know the debt exists, you're the one who ends up paying it. This is most visible in relationships where you play the strong one, the person who absorbs problems, who smooths over conflict, who never sets limits. At first, people admire this. Then they get used to it. Then they rely on it. And eventually, they stop recognizing it as a gift. When you ask for something back, time, space, effort, empathy, the confusion on their face isn't cruelty. It's calibration. They're calibrating to how you've always behaved. You think the problem is that people don't appreciate you. But the deeper truth is that you never showed them who you really are. You showed them the version who negotiates affection through service. You showed them the version who buys loyalty with self-abandonment. You showed them the version who treats love like a contract with microscopic emotional terms. When people fail to meet those terms, you call it betrayal. But it's not betrayal, it's misalignment. You operate under an internal system. They operate under a human one. Invisible contracts thrive on vagueness. You do more than necessary because you hope it secures you emotionally. They do less than necessary because the path of least resistance feels natural. You keep investing, hoping the pattern will eventually shift. They keep taking, assuming you're comfortable. This unspoken imbalance forces you into one of the most destructive psychological behaviors: boundary collapse. You lower your standards each time the contract isn't met. You accept less effort, less respect, less presence. your threshold for disappointment becomes disturbingly high. And the higher it gets, the more you normalize your own depletion. When you finally break, it's not because they hurt you. It's because you hurt yourself while expecting them to stop you. Invisible contracts don't make you loved. They make you predictable. And predictability without boundaries turns you into emotional infrastructure. Reliable, silent, unnoticed unless malfunctioning. You keep giving, hoping someone will read your sacrifices as sincerity. But sincerity isn't the problem. The silence is. You can't be understood inside a contract only you can see. There's a moment, subtle, quiet, almost unnoticeable, when being helpful stops being generosity and becomes compliance. You don't mark the shift on your calendar. You don't feel it happen in your chest. But over time, your decisions stop coming from choice and start coming from fear. Fear of disappointing someone. Fear of not being chosen again. Fear of becoming irrelevant the moment you stop accommodating. You don't call it fear, of course. You call it being considerate. You call it being reliable. You call it being supportive. But underneath the polished language lives a single unspoken truth. You adjust yourself so no one has a reason to leave you. Fear-driven compliance is one of the most sophisticated forms of self-betrayal because it disguises itself as emotional maturity. You convince yourself that being agreeable is the healthier path. You tell yourself conflict is unnecessary. You tell yourself needs are inconvenient. And because you silence your own discomfort, others learn to silence their awareness of it too. Compliance becomes your identity. You don't realize how much of your life is shaped by avoidance. Avoiding abandonment, avoiding rejection, avoiding the sharp pain of disapproval. Every time you anticipate someone's reaction and adjust your behavior to soften it, you reinforce the belief that your existence is conditional. Conditional on how well you serve. Conditional on how little you burden. Conditional on how consistently you shrink. This is how self-worth erosion takes hold. Not in dramatic breakdowns, but in small, repeated acts of emotional self-censorship. Saying yes when you're exhausted, laughing when you're hurt, pretending you're fine when you're quietly drowning. People see the smile, they never see the erosion happening inside it. Fear-driven compliance also distorts your sense of identity. You become a mirror for other people's preferences. You shift your personality depending on the emotional weather of the room. You try to be agreeable enough for them, adaptable enough for them, beneficial enough for them. You forget that you is supposed to be a standalone entity, not a shapeshifter molded by the needs of whoever happens to be nearby. But the harshest consequence is what happens to your boundaries. They dissolve. Not all at once, but like sand pulled gently away by an indifferent tide. Every time you avoid asserting yourself, you teach people how little resistance they'll meet. Every time you let your discomfort go unspoken, you reinforce the idea that their comfort matters more than your honesty. Eventually, people don't cross your boundaries. They simply walk through the empty space where boundaries should have been. And because you're operating from fear, you don't see this as mistreatment. You see it as inevitability. This is where learned helplessness begins. You start believing you have no influence over how people treat you. You think the disrespect is random. You think the imbalance is fate. You think the exhaustion is the natural cost of being good. So you stop trying to change it. You keep your head down, convince yourself it's temporary, and carry the emotional weight on your own shoulders. But here's the truth you avoid. You're not helpless. You're obedient. Fear has conditioned you to stay quiet, compliant, and endlessly available. And because obedience becomes your default, people stop seeing you as someone with preferences and limits. They see you as someone who adapts, someone who absorbs, accommodates, endures. Fear-driven compliance also corrupts your relationships. When you avoid asserting your needs, people bond with the version of you who has none. When you avoid conflict, people bond with the version who never pushes back. When you avoid expressing disappointment, people bond with the version who never feels hurt. So when you finally reach your breaking point, when you finally express frustration, or ask for more, or say no, they don't understand. Not because they're cruel, but because you've never shown them this version of you. You've been performing stability for so long that they mistake your compliance for your character. And compliance turns you into something you never wanted to be, a quiet participant in your own diminishing. Because the more you obey your fear, the more the world learns to expect your silence. There comes a point when your body realizes the truth long before your mind is willing to admit it. Your exhaustion stops feeling like tiredness and starts feeling like erosion. Your silence stops feeling like peace and starts feeling like suffocation. Your usefulness stops feeling like purpose and starts feeling like servitude. This is the hidden cost of self-betrayal, not the dramatic collapse you fear, but the slow, grinding decay that happens when you trade your identity for acceptance. Self-betrayal begins innocently. You tell yourself you're being flexible, understanding, mature. You tell yourself you're just choosing your battles. But with every unspoken frustration, another small part of your honesty withers. With every suppressed boundary, another layer of your dignity thins. With every time you swallow your needs to maintain harmony, you teach yourself that your inner world is negotiable. But dignity is not something you can trade without consequence. Every compromise you make for the sake of being loved becomes a brick in the wall that separates you from yourself. This is where loss aversion shapes your behavior in ways you barely notice. You cling to relationships, habits, and dynamics, not because they nourish you, but because losing them feels unbearable. You fear the emptiness more than the exhaustion. You fear the unknown more than the imbalance. You fear the temporary discomfort of asserting yourself more than the long-term damage of disappearing. And so you accept situations that drain you simply because you're terrified of what leaving them might mean. Loss aversion convinces you that keeping people, even the wrong ones, is safer than risking solitude. But solitude isn't the enemy. Self-abandonment is. When you betray yourself long enough, you lose the internal compass that once told you what felt right or wrong. You stop trusting your intuition because you've overridden it too many times. You stop believing your needs matter because you've neglected them too consistently. You stop expecting respect because you've tolerated its absence for too long. This is the tragedy of self-betrayal. By the time you realize you've crossed your limits, you don't even remember where those limits originally were. You've blurred your identity so thoroughly that you no longer know which parts of your life are authentically yours and which are survival strategies you collected over the years. But the most painful part is something quieter, the reciprocity breakdown inside your own psyche. You keep giving emotional energy outward, but nothing returns inward. You invest in connections that don't replenish you. You support people who don't ground you. You soothe others while ignoring the tension in your own chest. You create relief for everyone except the one person who has to live with the consequences. You. Self-betrayal may feel noble in the moment, but over time, it turns you into an emotional ghost in your own life. You show up, but you're not present. You help, but you're not seen. You care, but you're not cared for. You perform usefulness until usefulness becomes your personality. Hollow, exhausted, permanently one step away from collapse. Eventually, you reach the moment you've been trying to avoid. The moment where you can no longer pretend you're okay. The moment when your body says no, even though your mouth is still trying to say yes. The moment where the cost of being indispensable finally outweighs the emotional crumbs you receive in return. This is the quiet breaking point, the realization that your obsession with being loved through usefulness never brought you closeness. It brought you dependency, obligation, and silent resentment. It turned you into a supporting character in everyone else's story, while leaving your own story unwritten. The truth is simple and brutal. You didn't lose people because you weren't enough. You lost yourself because you tried to be too much. Self-betrayal was never the path to belonging. It was the slowest, most painful way to disappear. You've spent so much of your life trying to earn what was supposed to be freely given. You tried to purchase affection through effort, trade usefulness for security, and negotiate your way into being irreplaceable. But somewhere along the path of constant giving, you forgot the simplest truth. Love built on self-erasure isn't love. It's dependency, disguised as acceptance. Tonight isn't about blame. It's about awareness. It's about stepping back from the habits that once felt necessary and seeing them for what they are. Survival strategies you no longer need. You're not meant to be a vending machine for other people's comfort. You're not meant to live on emotional credit, hoping someone will eventually repay what you've invested. You're allowed to take up space. You're allowed to disappoint people. You're allowed to be a person with limits, needs, and non-negotiables. As you walk back into your life, do it gently, quietly. No grand declarations, no dramatic transformations. Just small, consistent acts of self-respect. A pause before saying yes. A moment of honesty before suppressing your feelings. A willingness to walk away from spaces where you're treated like convenience instead of connection. You don't need to be loved by everyone. You just need to stop abandoning yourself.